The raven arrived on a Tuesday, which was how Maester Luwin would later remember it, not because Tuesdays held any particular significance in the machinery of Westerosi fate, but because he had been in the middle of cataloging a shipment of medicines from the Citadel when the bird came, and he never finished the task. Some ravens changed everything they interrupted. Ned Stark read the letter twice, then a third time, standing at the window of his solar where the gray Winterfell sky pressed down like a hand on the shoulders of the world. The words did not change between readings. They rarely did, in Ned's experience, though he had learned long ago that meaning had a way of shifting even when letters stayed fixed. "My son needs the North," Robert had written, in the blunt, slightly irregular hand of a man who had always considered writing a lesser form of communication than shouting. "He needs you, Ned. He needs what you have up there. The cold and the stone and whatever it is that makes your people real. Cersei has made him into something I don't recognize. I am asking you as your king. I am begging you as your friend. Take my son and make him worthy of what he'll inherit." There was no please. Robert Baratheon had never learned the word in any language that counted. Catelyn received the news that evening, in the great hall where the fire burned against October's first serious cold. Her reaction was measured and precise in the way that Catelyn Tully Stark was always measured and precise when she was, in fact, furious. "The Crown Prince," she said. "Here, in this house." Robert asks it. Robert commands it and calls it asking. She set down her cup with the particular gentleness that meant she was choosing not to throw it. "And Cersei? What does Cersei say?" Ned said nothing, because the letter had said nothing of Cersei, which was itself an answer of a kind. Catelyn looked at him across the fire, and he could see her calculating the beds that would need preparing, the household dynamics that would shift, the careful balance of her children's world that a prince's presence would immediately destabilize. Cat was not cruel, but she was clear-eyed in ways that Ned sometimes envied and sometimes found heartbreaking. She saw what was coming before it arrived, which was a gift that Westeros regularly punished. "Robb will resent him," she said finally. "Robb will try not to, because he is your son and he will try to be honorable about it. But he'll resent him. Robb will survive resentment. And Jon." The fire cracked between them. Ned thought about Jon, 12 years old and already expert at the specific stillness of someone who has learned that their presence in a room is conditional. Jon would look at a prince of the realm and know, bone deep, that rank had already decided something between them before a word was exchanged. "Jon will manage," Ned said, which was both true and insufficient, and they both knew it. "And the boy himself?" Catelyn's voice was careful now, feeling for the shape of something she didn't want to say plainly. "What they say about him, Ned. What comes south through the merchant routes and the gossip of lordly ravens. He tortured a cat in the Red Keep when he was 6. He had a kitchen boy's hand broken because the bread was wrong. He is 8 years old. Joffrey Baratheon is 8 years old in the way that a blade is young before it's sharpened." She met his eyes. "I will do my duty. This house will do its duty. But I want you to understand what you are agreeing to bring inside these walls." Ned understood. He had understood from the third reading of the letter. If he was honest, which he generally was, at some cost, he was agreeing to bring a child into his home. A damaged, dangerous, gold-wrapped child who had been handed every cruelty as a reward and every kindness as a manipulation, who had been taught that the world existed to confirm his desires, and that pain was something that happened to other people. He was also agreeing because Robert had asked, because 20 years of friendship and war and the memory of a rebellion fought on mud and grief demanded it, because somewhere inside the letter's blunt, kingly demand was a father's desperate admission that he had already failed his son and knew it. The ravens went south. The preparations began. Winterfell absorbed the news the way the North absorbed most things, with a gray, enduring, faintly skeptical patience. Joffrey arrived 6 weeks later with an escort of 12 Lannister household guards in crimson cloaks, a wheelhouse that was aggressively unsuited to northern roads, and an expression of profound, theatrical disdain that he wore like armor. He was small for his age, Ned noticed that first, though it was quickly buried under everything else. Small and fair and almost preternaturally beautiful in the Lannister way, with green eyes that had already learned the particular trick of looking at people as though calculating their utility. He stepped from the wheelhouse into Winterfell's yard and looked up at the gray stone towers and the cold sky, and the Stark family assembled to receive him. And his lip did something that was not quite a curl, but was practicing for one. "It's smaller than I expected," he announced to no one in particular. Robb, 14, and already broad across the shoulders, said nothing. His jaw did something, though. Jon, standing slightly back and to the left in the habitual geometry of his position in any Stark gathering, watched the prince with the careful attention of someone who has learned that first impressions carry weight you can't put down later. Arya, 9 years old and constitutionally incapable of diplomatic silence, said, "It's a castle, not a palace. They're supposed to be cold." Joffrey looked at her with the eyes of someone who had never been contradicted by a girl and was not immediately sure what the appropriate response was. Ned stepped forward before the moment could calcify into something worse. "Prince Joffrey, welcome to Winterfell. My house is honored by your presence." The words were true in the technical sense that all courtesies are true, they described, a reality that the speaker had decided to commit to regardless of feeling. Joffrey transferred his assessment to Ned Stark. Something moved through those green eyes, not warmth, not exactly, but a kind of recalibration. The boy had met lords before. He had met the great men of the South in their finery, performing their deference with the smooth expertise of the politically experienced. Ned Stark was performing nothing. He stood in the courtyard of his home and looked at the prince with the direct, measuring regard of a man who genuinely could not be impressed by a title. For perhaps the first time in his 8 years of living, Joffrey Baratheon encountered someone who was not afraid of him, not performing for him, and not trying to get something from him, and had absolutely no framework for understanding what that meant. "Lord Stark," the prince said finally, and his voice came out slightly less certain than he'd intended. It was, Maester Luwin would think later, the first honest thing the boy had said since stepping out of the wheelhouse. Uncertainty, briefly visible. A crack in the gold. Small, but it was there. In the kennels that evening, Ghost padded silently past the new guest's appointed chambers, and the direwolf paused, ears forward, reading something in the air that no human nose could catch, then moved on, satisfied or unsatisfied, impossible to say. Winter was coming. It always was. But something else was coming too. Something that didn't have a name yet. The slow, grinding, unglamorous possibility that a boy could be unmade and remade, if the right hands found him early enough and held firm long enough and refused, absolutely refused, to look away. Ned Stark had held the North against worse odds than one damaged child. He was not certain he would win this one. But the Starks did not surrender their charges. And Robert had asked, and the boy was here now, standing in the cold for the first time in his life with no Cersei between him and what the world actually was. If you want to see more characters enter different universes, hit that subscribe button and drop the name of a character and the universe you'd want to see them in down in the comments below. All men must die, but legends endure. The first week was a study in collision, not the dramatic, explosive kind that songs remembered and maesters recorded, but the quieter, more corrosive kind that happened in yards and hallways and at long dining tables where the fire threw uneven light across faces that were all trying, with varying degrees of success, to be civil. Winterfell was a castle that had stood for 8,000 years on the bedrock principle that the world was hard and the people in it had better be harder, and it received Joffrey Baratheon the way it received everything that came from the south, with a patient, gray, faintly pitying endurance. Joffrey had brought a body servant, a nervous boy of 10 named Meryn, who had been trained to anticipate the prince's needs before they were expressed and to absorb the consequences when anticipation failed. On the second morning, Ned found the servant boy waiting outside the kitchens with a bruised wrist and an expression of practiced blankness that Ned recognized with a cold, specific anger as the face of someone who had learned that drawing attention to their pain only made it worse. He said nothing to the boy. He noted it, the way he noted everything, and stored it in the place where Ned Stark kept information that would eventually require action. Breakfast in Winterfell was not the elaborate production Joffrey was accustomed to. There was good bread and salted fish and porridge and whatever the hunt had provided the day before. served on plain wooden tables without ceremony or performance. The household ate together, lords and servants in their appropriate places. But the distance between those places was shorter in the north than it was in the south, and the rituals of deference were less elaborate and therefore, paradoxically, more genuine. Joffrey sat at the high table and looked at his bowl of porridge, as though it had personally offended him. "I don't eat porridge," he informed the serving woman who had placed it before him. The woman, Helda, who had served the Stark household for 30 years and had the unshakable calm of someone who had survived 3 harsh winters and 4 difficult births, looked at him with polite incomprehension and moved on to serve the next seat. Joffrey's expression moved through several stages, each one more dangerous than the last. He was not accustomed to being ignored. Ignoring the crown prince was either an act of extraordinary courage or extraordinary stupidity, and Helda was neither. She simply lived in a world where a child's title did not change the morning's menu. Robb, seated 2 places down, said without looking up from his own bowl, "It's good porridge. Cook put something in it. Honey, I think, or something like it. I don't care what's in it." "Then don't eat it." Robb's voice was entirely without aggression, which somehow made it worse. "No one's forcing you." Joffrey stared at him. Robb ate his porridge. The fire cracked in the hearth. From somewhere in the castle, a dog barked twice and went quiet. It was Jon who eventually pushed a plate of bread toward the prince, not looking at him either, not making a performance of the gesture, just moving the plate within reach, with the quiet pragmatism of someone who understood that people needed to eat regardless of their feelings about it. Joffrey looked at the bread, then at Jon. Something passed across the prince's face that might, in better light and with more generous interpretation, have been acknowledged hunger. He ate the bread. He said nothing. It was not gratitude, but it was something. The yard was where things became properly dangerous. Robb had been training with sword and shield since he could walk, and at 14 he was already what the North produced when it set itself to the task of making fighters, not flashy, not theatrical, but relentlessly competent in the way that cold and repetition, and a good master-at-arms manufactured. Ser Roderick Castle had been drilling Stark children in the fundamentals of combat for 2 decades, and his methods were not gentle. Joffrey had trained in King's Landing under a succession of masters who had been, whatever their technical skill, fundamentally in the business of not damaging the crown prince while allowing him to feel victorious. The result was a boy who had learned to swing a sword with reasonable form and had also learned that swinging a sword resulted in his opponent stepping back and his instructor nodding approvingly. Ser Roderick did not nod approvingly. Ser Roderick watched Joffrey's first demonstration with the expression of a man who has been handed something advertised as a sword and discovered it is made of paper. "Again," he said, when Joffrey had finished his prepared sequence of strikes. "But slower, and keep your elbow in." "That's how I was taught." "Then you were taught wrong." "Elbow in." Again, the moment cracked open in a way that Joffrey wasn't prepared for. He had been told his form was excellent. He had been told this by trained men with decades of experience, or men who presented themselves as such. And now a scarred, white-whiskered northern master-at-arms with dirt on his boots was telling him, not asking, not suggesting, that everything he knew was wrong. "Do you know who I am?" Joffrey asked, and his voice had the particular quality of someone reaching for a weapon they've always found reliable. "I," said Ser Roderick. "You're the boy with his elbow out." Again, Robb, sparring with Jon 20 feet away, did not look over, but his rhythm shifted almost imperceptibly, the slight adjustment of someone controlling their reaction. Jon did look over, briefly. His expression was unreadable, in the way that Jon's expressions were often unreadable. Not cold, exactly, but contained, processed privately before anything reached the surface. Joffrey's face went through the full red-gold spectrum of Lannister fury. Then something happened. That was rarer and more interesting than the fury. He swallowed it. Not well, not gracefully, but he swallowed it, and he brought his elbow in, and he ran the sequence again. It was better. Marginally. Ser Roderick said nothing, which in his particular pedagogical language meant marginal improvement had been noted and would be built upon. The progress was not linear. Nothing about Joffrey was linear. On the 4th day, he reduced his body servant, Meryn, to tears over a cloak that had been packed incorrectly. And when Ned heard of it, he came to the prince's chambers in the early evening with the deliberate, unhurried step of a man who had decided that a thing needed to be said and had committed himself fully to the saying of it. "Walk with me," he said. It was not a request. Joffrey understood, viscerally if not intellectually, the difference between Robert's commands wrapped as requests, which could be deflected with charm, or Cersei's intervention, and this, which was something else entirely. Something that didn't have the heat of authority but had its weight. He followed. Ned took him to the Godswood at the castle's heart, because the Godswood was where Ned went when he needed to think clearly and speak honestly. And he had found over the years that the space had a way of insisting on both. The heart tree rose above them in the last thin November light, its pale bark carved with the face that had watched 10,000 years of stark grief and stark decision, its red leaves falling in the wind like slow drops of something older than blood. "Sit," Ned said, and sat himself on the root bench where he had come to pray and think since he was Joffrey's age. The prince sat. He was trying for dignity and mostly achieving it, which was something. "The boy Meryn," Ned said. "Tell me what happened." "He packed the wrong cloak." "The gray one, not the..." "Tell me what you did when he packed the wrong cloak." A pause. The wind moved the red leaves. Somewhere beyond the Godswood wall, Winterfell continued its evening routines, the sound of the kitchen fires, the distant bark of dogs, the creak of the gate being secured for the night. "I corrected him," Joffrey said. "You heard him." The prince's jaw set. He needed to learn. Meryn is 10 years old and frightened of his own shadow because everyone who has ever held authority over him has used it to cause him pain. Ned's voice was even, not cold. That was the difference. The thing Joffrey kept encountering in this man that he had no category for. Not cold and not warm, but something else entirely. Something that simply was what it was and did not perform itself. When you hurt someone weaker than you to correct their mistake, you do not teach them to do better. You teach them to be afraid. Fear makes people smaller. Smaller people make more mistakes. You will end up with a terrified boy who cannot pack a cloak correctly and cannot learn to, because he is spending every thought on surviving your attention. Joffrey said nothing. He was looking at the heart tree's carved face. "In this house," Ned continued, "you will correct servants with words. Once, clearly stated. If the mistake continues, you come to me or to Lady Stark or to the master of the household, and we address it through proper means. You do not raise your hand or your voice beyond what instruction requires. This is not a request, and it is not a suggestion, and it does not change because of who your father is." The green eyes came to Ned's face, and in them was something that Ned read carefully, not the calculating assessment of the first day, but something rawer, something that was trying to decide between anger and something it didn't have a name for yet. "My mother says." "Your mother is not here," Ned said, gently but completely. "You are. And here, these are the rules." The wind lifted a red leaf from the heart tree and carried it slowly down between them. Joffrey watched it fall. His hands in his lap were not quite fists. "Yes, Lord Stark," he said finally. Small, insufficient, 100 miles from understanding, let alone change. But it was said, and the heart tree's carved face looked down at them both with its ancient, patient expression, neither approving nor condemning. Watching in the way the old gods had always watched, without mercy, but also, crucially, without the cruelty that men had invented to fill in the spaces where mercy wasn't. The Godswood held its silence. Above them, winter gathered in the northern sky with the slow, certain patience of something that had never needed to hurry because it always, eventually, arrived. Winter in the north did not ease into itself the way seasons did in the south. It did not send ambassadors or issue warnings in the diplomatic language of cooling nights and shortening days. It arrived, fully formed and without apology, and it expected the people inside it to meet it on its own terms or suffer the precise and indifferent consequences of failing to do so. By November's end, the cold had settled over Winterfell like a judgment, and Joffrey Baratheon, who had never in his 8 years experienced weather that genuinely intended him harm, discovered that his body was not prepared for what the North considered a mild early-season chill. He wore 3 layers under his cloak at morning, training, and was still cold in. The way that seeped into the bones and stayed there. And the Stark children moved through the same yard in 2 layers as though the temperature were a personal friend. They were greeting warmly. "You get used to it," Bran told him, with the absolute sincerity of a 6-year-old who had never known anything else and therefore could not conceive of its being unusual. "I won't be here long enough to get used to it," Joffrey said. Bran considered this with his particular brand of frank, uncomplicated assessment. "Father says you're here until you're ready to go back." He didn't say when that would be. Joffrey looked at the boy, then at the gray sky above the training yard, then at his own breath misting in the air before him. Proof of a body doing its continuous, involuntary, undignified work of staying alive. He said nothing, which was becoming, almost without his awareness, a slightly more frequent response than it had been when he arrived. The sword work was changing him in ways he could not have articulated and would not have admitted. Not dramatically. Ser Roderick was not a man who produced dramatic transformations, any more than erosion produced dramatic changes in the moment of its occurring. But the repetition had a quality to it that Joffrey had never encountered in King's Landing, where even the most rigorous training sessions had been fundamentally performances with an audience of approving adults. Here there was no approval to perform for. There was only the drill and whether you did it correctly, and what happened to your body in a real sparring bout when you did it incorrectly. What happened was Robb Stark hit you. Not viciously. Robb did not spar viciously. He sparred with the particular focused efficiency of someone who had learned. That combat was a problem to be solved rather than a feeling to be expressed. But he hit accurately, and he hit hard enough to teach. And the first time his practice sword caught Joffrey cleanly across the ribs, because the prince had dropped his guard, reaching for an overextended strike. The shock of genuine pain, not punishment, not cruelty, but the clean, instructive pain of a mistake, meeting its consequence, did something to Joffrey's understanding of the world that no amount of Ned's patient evening conversations had quite managed. He sat down in the mud of the training yard. The cold came up through his breeches. He could hear Robb checking his swing, pulling back to assess, and somewhere behind him, Arya making a sound that was trying to be polite about itself and failing. "Elbow," said Ser Roderick from the fence. Joffrey got up. His ribs ached with the honest arithmetic of cause and effect. He brought his elbow in. He set his feet. "Again," he said, and his voice had lost something in the mud, some quality of performance that had been sitting on top of it since he arrived. What was underneath was smaller and less certain, but also, in some way that would take years to properly name, more real. Robb looked at him for a moment across the space between them. Then he nodded, once, with the brevity of someone who did not waste gestures. And they went again. It was Jon who found Joffrey in the library 3 nights later. The library was not a place the prince had sought. Out in his first weeks, he had been educated by a succession of tutors whose primary qualification seemed to have been their willingness to confirm whatever Joffrey already believed, and he had developed the attitude toward books common to students who have never been taught by someone who loved what they were teaching. But Winterfell's library was different from the Red Keep's, smaller and less grand, but inhabited in a way that suggested actual use rather than decoration, and on a night when the cold outside had reached the kind of seriousness that even 3 layers couldn't fully argue with, Joffrey had found himself there without quite deciding to be. Jon was already at the table, reading by a single candle with the absorbed stillness of someone who had been doing this for years. He looked up when Joffrey entered, registered the prince's presence, and returned to his book, not dismissively, not in the performance of ignoring him, but in the straightforward way of someone who had been reading and was continuing to read. Joffrey sat across from him. The silence between them was not comfortable exactly, but it was not hostile either. It was the silence of 2 people who had not yet decided what they were to each other. "What are you reading?" Joffrey asked, because it was something to say. "History of the Long Night." Jon turned the book so the cover was visible. Samwell Tarly, he's at the Citadel now. He wrote to say there are accounts in the older texts that don't match what the maesters teach. I wanted to see if Winterfell's copies were different. The Long Night is a story, Joffrey said. It was what he had been taught, by men who smiled when they said it. Jon looked at him with an expression that was not quite pity and Not quite its opposite. The men on the wall don't think so. The men on the wall are there because they had no better options. Some of them. Jon's voice was even, carrying nothing extra. Some of them are there because they believe in something. That's different. Joffrey had no immediate answer for this, which was itself a new experience. In King's Landing, he had never been required to construct an answer. He had only been required to pronounce. And the pronouncement had been received. Jon Snow was not receiving it. He was not arguing with it either. He was simply presenting an alternative, with the calm certainty of someone who had thought about it and arrived somewhere. You believe in it, Joffrey said. The White Walkers, the army of the dead. I believe in what the evidence suggests, Jon said. Father believes it. The Night's Watch believes it. I'd rather be wrong about. Believing a danger is real than wrong about. Believing it isn't. It was not an argument designed to persuade. It was simply a statement of how Jon Snow organized his thinking, offered without agenda because Jon Snow did not generally have agendas. He had convictions, which were different, less flexible, more expensive, ultimately more reliable. Joffrey sat with this for a moment in the candlelight. Outside the library window, the northern wind pressed against the glass with steady, impersonal insistence. My mother says the Night's Watch is where failures go to disappear, he offered. Not defending it exactly, but putting it on the table. Your mother has never been to the wall, Jon said, and went back to his book. It should have been an insult. Joffrey catalogued it carefully and found, to his own confusion, that it wasn't, or at least that it didn't feel like one in the way that dismissals usually felt. Jon was not dismissing Cersei to wound Joffrey. He was simply stating a fact that was relevant to the reliability of her assessment. It was a distinction Joffrey had never been taught to make because in King's Landing, most statements about Cersei Lannister were either flattery or attack, and the difference between those categories was everything. He reached across the table and pulled a different book toward him without asking. Jon did not look up. The candle burned between them, throwing their shadows large against the stone wall and outside. The first serious snow of the season began to fall on Winterfell in thick, quiet, indiscriminate sheets, covering the training yard and the Godswood and the gate and the road south in the same patient white, making everything equally unfamiliar, equally new. The months that followed moved in the rhythm of the North's particular calendar, training in the morning, lessons with Maester Luwin in the afternoon, evenings that belonged to whatever the castle's life required of them. Joffrey did not transform. That was the important thing to understand, the thing that would be misremembered in the years after, when the story of the prince's fostering became something told in halls and around fires. He did not become a Stark. He did not shed the Lannister gold that ran through him like a vein through marble, but he began to develop, alongside it, something that had no Lannister name. He learned that Helda's porridge was better than he'd admitted on the first morning. He learned that Ser Roderick's criticism was not contempt, but its opposite, that the old man corrected what he believed was worth correcting, and ignored what he had abandoned as hopeless, and that being corrected meant you were still considered reachable. He learned that Robb Stark's silences were not hostile, and that Jon Snow's were not either. That northern people communicated a significant percentage of what mattered in the spaces between words, and that if you paid attention to those spaces, the words themselves became more legible. He did not stop being cruel, but the cruelty became less reflexive, less constant, a response to specific provocations rather than a permanent condition of his engagement with the world. Ned noticed this, said nothing directly about it, because Ned had learned that direct acknowledgement of Joffrey's progress caused the boy to become self-conscious in ways that reversed it. He simply continued the evening walks, the Godswood conversations, the patient, relentless, entirely unsentimental project of treating the prince as someone who was expected to be better and would be held to that expectation regardless of title or temperament. Meryn the body servant stopped flinching when Joffrey entered the room. It was not redemption. It was the first, fragile precondition of the possibility of it, which was different but not nothing. The ravens continued to come from King's Landing, regular as tides. Cersei's letters wrapped in the familiar scent of southern perfume and maternal love sharpened to a point. Joffrey read them in his chambers with a feeling he could not quite name, something that was not quite homesickness and not quite relief at the distance. but lived in the complicated territory between. He did not write back as often as his mother expected. When he did, the letters were shorter than she wanted, and had less of what she was looking for in them. And this was a gap that Cersei Lannister noticed the way she noticed everything, with the precise, cold, dangerous attention of a woman who had learned that the world gave you nothing, and fought accordingly. The snow fell. The training continued. The godswood kept its patient counsel. Somewhere to the north, beyond the walls, ancient magic. In the blue-white silence of a world that had been waiting longer than any kingdom, something vast and cold registered, without urgency. The small warmth of a prince learning, slowly, imperfectly, against every instinct his mother had installed in him, what it meant to be responsible for the people around him. It did not hurry. It never did. Winter, in the end, always came to everyone. The heart tree had no opinions, or if it did, it kept them in the particular language of wind through red leaves and the slow, patient movement of sap through wood that was older than the Stark name itself. Ned had been coming to the godswood since childhood to think in its presence, not because he believed the old gods intervened in human affairs with any regularity, but because the space demanded a quality of honesty that the rest of the castle, with its fires and its people and its endless requirements, did not always make room for. He brought Joffrey there deliberately and often, and for reasons he did not fully articulate even to Catelyn. The boy needed, Ned had concluded after 2 months of careful observation, something that King's Landing had systematically denied him, not discipline. Though discipline was necessary and not affection, though the absence of genuine affection had done its own damage. What Joffrey needed, at the root of everything, was someone who would look at him without wanting something from the looking. Cersei's love was real, but it was also weaponized, deployed to bind and fortify and confirm. Robert's attention was intermittent, and guilty and expressed, itself mostly in excess, gifts, permissions, the loud, empty endorsement of a man who felt the distance between himself and his son and tried to throw things across it rather than cross it himself. The court's deference was pure transaction, affection as currency, approval available for purchase. Ned Stark looked at Joffrey and wanted him to be better, because better was what people owed each other and owed the positions they would occupy. It was neither warm nor cold. It simply was, the way the godswood simply was. And Joffrey, who had been marinated since birth in wanting and transaction, and the specific toxicity of unconditional approval, kept returning to it the way a man with a fever sought the cool side of the pillow, without understanding why, without admitting he was seeking anything. It was in the godswood, on a sharp February morning, when the cold had the particular crystalline quality that Minute had fully committed to itself, that Joffrey asked a question that had been working its way toward the surface for weeks. Why did you execute Will? Ned looked at him. Will had been a deserter from the Night's Watch, brought to Winterfell 3 weeks ago, tried in the Great Hall with the brief, formal efficiency of Northern justice, and executed in the yard with Ned's own hand on the blade. Joffrey had watched from the battlements. Ned had known he was watching and had not sent him away, because the watching was part of it. Because he deserted his post, Ned said. You could have sent him to the wall cells. You could have had someone else do it. The man who passes the sentence should swing the sword. Ned's voice was even, carrying the words the way stone carries weight, without straining, without drama. If you cannot bear to kill a man, you have no business condemning him. And if you cannot look at what your justice means in the flesh, you should not be dispensing it. Joffrey was quiet for a moment. The cold moved through the godswood with a sound like the world breathing. In King's Landing, the boy said carefully, the headsman does it. The king watches, sometimes. My father watched once, when I was small. He didn't look like it troubled him. Your father is a man who has killed in war and found it came easily to him. He is not troubled by death because he has made peace with it, which is one way to be. But he has also spent his reign sending men to their deaths by decree and never lifting the sword himself, and I think, though I would not say this to his face, that the distance has cost him something he doesn't know he's missing. This was more of himself than Ned usually offered in these conversations, and he said it with the awareness that he was saying it, choosing it deliberately. Joffrey needed to understand that the men who held authority had the capacity to reflect on it, that power and self-examination were not opposites. that the willingness to question your own exercise of authority was not weakness, but its opposite. "You think my father is wrong," Joffrey said, and there was no accusation in it. He was testing the shape of the idea. "I think your father is a great man who has not always been a careful one. Greatness and carefulness are different virtues and rarely come together without deliberate effort." Ned paused. "What did you feel watching Will?" The green eyes came to the heart tree's carved face, deflecting slightly. The reflex of someone who has learned that showing what they feel creates vulnerability. "I don't know," Joffrey said, which was honest enough that Ned credited it. "Try." A long pause. A red leaf detached from the weirwood and spiraled slowly down between them, catching the thin winter light like a small flag of something. "It seemed real," Joffrey said finally. "More real than anything I'd watched before. In the city, when they execute people, there's a crowd and it's almost like a show. Like it's happening to a character in a story. But Will was just a man. He wasn't monstrous. He was just afraid." "Yes," Ned said. "And you still did it." "Yes." "Does it trouble you?" Ned looked at the heart tree for a moment. "Every time," he said. "That's how I know I'm still fit to do it. The day it stops troubling me is the day I should give up the sword." Joffrey absorbed this with the concentrated stillness that had become, over the months, one of his more surprising capacities. The boy who had arrived, unable to tolerate a pause in his own gratification, had developed, slowly and unevenly, the ability to sit with an idea and turn it in his mind before responding. It was not wisdom. It was the precondition of wisdom, which was the ability to slow down enough to think before acting. And it was a precondition that Ned had begun to suspect Joffrey had been systematically denied in King's Landing, where every impulse had been facilitated before it could be examined. "My mother would say that's weakness," Joffrey said, feeling troubled. "Your mother has survived in a world that punishes softness, in women far more harshly than it punishes it in men," Ned said, choosing his words with the care of someone navigating territory where honesty and damage were close neighbors. "She has built herself accordingly. I respect the strength that required. But the armor she built to survive King's Landing is not the only way to be strong. And it may not be the right armor for a king." Joffrey looked at him with an expression that was new, something that had come in over the last month and not yet been named. It was not the calculating assessment of the first day, and it was not the raw, exposed uncertainty of the early God's Wood conversations. It was something between them, something that was beginning, tentatively, to resemble the look of someone who was being taught rather than merely managed. "What is the right armor?" he asked. "I'm not certain there is one. I think the best kings govern themselves first, their anger, their fear, their desire for approval, and govern their kingdoms second. A man who cannot master himself cannot master others without becoming a tyrant. And tyrants always fall, eventually, when the people they've ground down find something left in them to push back with." The words moved through the cold Godswood air and settled. Joffrey said nothing for a long moment, and Ned did not fill the silence, because the silence was doing work. What he did not say, and what he had been turning in his own mind since the boy's arrival, was that the question of what armor was right for a king was not academic. Joffrey Baratheon would be king. Not might be, would be. Barring the kind of catastrophic upheaval that Ned's habitual northern pragmatism acknowledged as possible but chose not to dwell on. He would sit the Iron Throne, and the Iron Throne would do to him what it did to everyone who sat it, which was reveal who they actually were beneath whatever they had managed to construct above it. The question that occupied Ned Stark's evenings, in the honest dark of his own mind, was whether what they were constructing, together in this Godswood and this training yard and these long northern winters, would be enough to survive that revelation. Whether a boy who had been 8 years in Cersei's hands could be genuinely reshaped by 2 or 3 years in the North's, or whether what they were doing was something more fragile, a surface laid over a structure that hadn't changed, which would hold under ordinary pressure and shatter under extraordinary. He did not know. That was the truth of it. He was doing what he could with what he had, the way the North had always done, and trusting that effort honestly made was not nothing. The training continued into March, and March brought with it a development that neither Ned nor Ser Roderick had planned, but both recognized. When it arrived, the moment when Joffrey won a sparring bout against a boy His own age, legitimately, through positioning and timing rather than through the opponent's deference. It was against a young guardsman's son named Tommen, not the prince's brother, just a coincidence of names. And the bout was unremarkable by any objective standard. But Joffrey stood over it, afterward with an expression that was purely and simply satisfaction, uncomplicated by audience or performance, the look of someone who had done a thing and knew they had done it, and did not require anyone else to confirm it. Robb, watching from the fence, said, "Better." One word. Robb's economy of approval was such that it functioned almost as a fusion when it came. Joffrey looked at him with the green eyes and said nothing, but something shifted in his posture, a degree of the defensive rigidity releasing, not because he had been told he was wonderful, but because he had been told something true. That evening, Ned found the prince in the yard after dinner, alone in the early dark, running the drill sequence Ser Roderick had assigned. Elbow in, weight forward, the forms precise in the way things become. Precise when you have done them enough. Times to stop thinking about them and start feeling them. He watched from the doorway without announcing himself, because the moment had its own quality and he did not want to intrude on it. Joffrey moved through the sequence in the freezing dark, breath misting, and there was nothing performed about it. No audience to play for, no approval to seek. Just a boy and a practiced sword and the cold and the work. The heart tree, rooted deep in its godswood 50 feet away, continued its ancient, patient observation of the Stark household and its newest, strangest, most complicated ward. Its carved face showed nothing, as it always showed nothing, as the old gods had always maintained. Their counsel in the face of human effort and human failure and the long, slow, grinding question of whether people could change or only revealed what they had always been. The drill continued. The cold held. The dark deepened around Winterfell's walls. And from King's Landing, 3 days Raven flight south, a letter was already written and sealed, waiting for a courier willing to ride north in winter weather. Cersei Lannister's handwriting was elegant and controlled, and the words inside the sealed parchment were the same, elegant, controlled, and working patiently, toward a purpose that had nothing to do with her son's improvement and everything to do with her son's return. The letter arrived on a Wednesday, which was how Maester Luwin would remember it, not because Wednesdays held significance, but because he had been transcribing Joffrey's progress notes when the courier came, and the timing felt like the castle exhaling something it had been holding. Cersei's letter was addressed to her son. This was its first piece of strategy, bypassing Ned entirely, arriving in Joffrey's hands before any adult in the household could assess its contents. The second piece of strategy was its opening, which Luwin would never read but could have predicted with reasonable accuracy, because Cersei Lannister had one fundamental instrument and she played it with genuine virtuosity. The letter would begin with love. Real love, not performed. Cersei's love for her children was the most genuine thing about her, which was precisely what made it dangerous. It was love alloyed with possession. Love that could not distinguish between protecting someone and controlling them. Love that would burn the world to ash, rather than release its object to the world's uncertain keeping. Joffrey read the letter in his chambers, alone, and Ned did not ask to see it because asking to see it would have been the wrong move. The move that confirmed Cersei's framing of the North as a place that kept her son from her, that held him against his nature, that required circumvention. Ned gave the boy his privacy and waited, with the patience of a man who had learned that some things had to come to him rather than being gone after. What came to him 2 evenings later in the Godswood was a version of Joffrey that he had not seen in several months, the earlier version, the one from the wheelhouse and the first breakfast, the one with the lip that practiced curling and the eyes that calculated. Not fully. The months had left their marks too deeply for a single letter to erase them entirely. But the defensive architecture had gone back up, and Ned could see the joins where it met the newer construction and strained against it. "She wants me to come home," Joffrey said. He was sitting on the root bench looking at the heart tree with the expression of someone listening to two voices arguing at the same time. "I know," Ned said. "She says," he stopped, started again. "She says you're filling my head with northern smallfolk sentiment, that you're teaching me to think like a Lord of the North instead of a King of the Seven Kingdoms." Ned sat beside him and looked at the weirwood, and said nothing for a moment. Because what Cersei had written was not entirely wrong, and he needed to be honest about that rather than dismissing it. "There's some truth in it," he said. Joffrey looked at him with surprise sharp enough to have an edge. "What I'm teaching you is how things work in the North. The North is not the Seven Kingdoms, it's one of them. And not the richest, or the most powerful, or the most politically central. A king of the Seven Kingdoms will need to understand King's Landing, and the Reach in the Westerlands, and the Riverlands as well as he understands Winterfell." Ned paused. "What I'd argue is that understanding the North gives you something the other kingdoms can't, a measure of what governance looks like, when it isn't primarily about accumulating advantage. The North survives because its people work together against a common threat. That's not sentiment. That's practical." She says the lords of the South will never respect a king who thinks like a northern lord. The lords of the South respect power and competence and consistency. The particular accent of a king's philosophy matters less than whether he applies it reliably. Ned turned to look at the boy directly. "Your mother is right that King's Landing requires things the North doesn't. The political complexity there is real. The need to manage competing lords, to balance factions, to understand that some men respond only to incentive and not to principle." She's not wrong about any of that. What I question is whether the solution to those requirements is to have no principles at all. Joffrey was quiet, which had become his most reliable sign of genuine engagement. The wind moved through the godswood with the sound of the world settling. "She also says Jon is a bastard and I shouldn't be spending time with him," the prince said, and his voice carried a specific flatness that was the acoustic equivalent of stepping carefully around something. Ned felt the cold of the statement differently from the cold of the evening. "Jon is my son," he said, and the words were simple and absolute in the way that Ned's words were when they were done negotiating with themselves. "She says bastards are. I know what she says bastards are." Ned's voice did not rise. "And I know there are lords in the South who share her view. What I know is that Jon Snow has more honor in his daily conduct than most trueborn lords I've met in 40 years of life, and that the circumstances of a person's birth tell you something about their parents' choices and nothing reliable about their character." He looked at Joffrey steadily. "You will make your own judgment about Jon. I'm not asking you to love him or name him. Your blood brother. I'm asking you to judge him by what you've actually seen of him, not by a category your mother handed you before you'd met him." The green eyes held his for a moment. Then Joffrey looked away, back at the weirwood. "He lent me his book on the long night," the prince said. "He didn't ask for it back." "No," Ned agreed. "He wouldn't." The silence that followed was not comfortable exactly, but it was working silence. The kind where things were being processed rather than avoided. Ned let it continue until Joffrey broke it himself, which was the other thing the months had built in the boy, the capacity to sit with uncomfortable silence rather than filling it with the first thing that came. "I'm not going back," Joffrey said. "I don't want to go back yet." A pause. Is it wrong to not want to?" "No," Ned said. "What is it you don't want to leave?" Joffrey's expression moved through several variations of a thing it was not ready to name directly. "The training," he said finally. "Ser Roderick, I want to be better at it than Robb before I leave." His jaw set with the familiar Lannister stubbornness, but it was pointed at something different now, not entitlement, but ambition that had found a legitimate object. "He beats me 4 times out of 5. I want it to be 3. Ned almost smiled. Did not, because smiling at it would have made it self-conscious, and the thing was more valuable unconscious. "Then we'll tell your mother you're staying until the spring thaw makes the roads easier for travel," he said. "Which is true and will satisfy her, logistically, without giving her the argument she's looking for." Joffrey looked at him with something that was developing, slowly, into the thing Ned had been waiting months to see, not gratitude, which was too simple, but the specific look of someone who was beginning to understand that they were being helped by a person who did not need anything from the helping. "She'll send another letter," the prince said. "She will. Worse than this one." "Almost certainly." Ned rose from the root bench and settled his cloak against the cold. "The North has survived worse than Cersei Lannister's correspondence. We'll manage." What Ned did not tell Joffrey And what occupied the private hours of his thinking in the weeks that followed was that Cersei's letter had done more than he'd shown in the Godswood. It had arrived like a cold reminder that the project he was engaged in was not happening in isolation, that there were forces with genuine power and genuine intelligence working in the opposite direction, and that unlike the White Walkers or the cold or the thousand ordinary difficulties of northern life, Cersei Lannister was not indifferent. She was paying attention, she was adapting, and she had the advantage of knowing her son in ways that Ned never would. Catelyn read the letter when Ned showed her. He'd copied the relevant sections from memory, which she accepted without comment on the ethics of it. She's not wrong that he needs to go back eventually, Catelyn said. They were in their chambers, the fire built up against the deepening March cold, the castle quiet around them. No, she's not. And she's not wrong. That what you're building here won't survive King's Landing. Intact, Kat's voice was careful, feeling for the things she wanted to say without being cruel about it. Ned, you are a good man trying to make a good king. But King's Landing is not a place where good men set the terms. It's a place where good men either learn the other game or get destroyed by it. I know. Do you think 2 years in Winterfell will give him enough to survive that? Ned looked at the fire for a long moment. I think 2 years in Winterfell will give him something he didn't have before, he said. Whether it's enough depends on things I can't control. He paused. But I'd rather he have it, and it not be enough than not have it at all. Catelyn looked at him with the expression she sometimes wore when his honesty arrived, in a form that was simultaneously admirable and infuriating. The expression of a woman who loved a man whose virtues were inseparable from the limitations they created. The letter to Robert, she said. You should write it. I know. Tell him what you're seeing. Tell him the boy is changing. Give him something to defend against. Cersei's version of events when she brings it to him, which she will. Ned nodded. He knew Catelyn was right. The political dimension of Joffrey's fostering had to be maintained as carefully as the personal dimension, because Cersei was already fighting on that front and he had been, perhaps deliberately, avoiding it. He was better in the Godswood than in the Correspondence War. But the Correspondence War was real and required fighting. He wrote to Robert that night, a careful, honest account of the prince's progress, the sparring improvements, the library evenings, the Godswood conversations. He wrote it in the plain, direct language that Robert preferred, without embellishment or politics, because Robert's great gift was that he could still recognize plain truth when it was presented to him without agenda. What Robert would do with it. In a court where Cersei had 30 years of practice at managing his perceptions and Ned had a raven and goodwill, was another matter. The letter went south with the morning courier. The cold held over. Winterfell with the assurance of something that knew it, had more months left in it yet. And in his chambers, Joffrey read Jon's book on the long night until the candle guttered. And when it went out, he lay in the dark thinking about things that had been dead for 8,000 years and might not be. And about a bastard who had lent him a book without asking for anything back, and about what it meant that the things he was least willing to admit mattered were, increasingly, the things that did. The ranging was not supposed to include the prince. It had been organized as a routine patrol, 3 of Winterfell's more experienced guardsmen riding north to investigate reports from a village near the last river of livestock disappearing, in ways that the villagers described with the specific frightened vagueness of people who had seen something they didn't have language for. Ned had approved it without particular concern. Livestock disappearances in the North's outer villages had a dozen mundane explanations, most of them involving the ordinary predations of winter and the way cold pushed larger animals south from the haunted forest in search of food. Joffrey had asked to go, not demanded, asked, a distinction that had become significant enough over the months to register. He had come to Ned's solar in the late morning with the particular stance he had developed for making requests he wasn't certain would be granted, which was different from his earlier posture for demands he expected to be fulfilled. He stood straighter when he was asking rather than commanding, as though bracing for the possibility of no, which was itself a form of respect for the word. You've been in Winterfell since October, Ned said, weighing it. You've seen the Godswood, and the training yard, and the library, and the Great Hall, and the kennels, Joffrey said. I've seen the kennels. He paused. I want to see what you actually govern. Not the castle, the land. It was the right argument, which was why Ned suspected Jon had helped him construct it. Jon had a gift for identifying the case that would land with a specific person, not because he was manipulative, but because he paid genuine attention to how people thought, and the ability was all the more persuasive for being unconscious. Ned said yes. With conditions, Joffrey would ride with the patrol, not lead it, and he would follow Harwin's instruction without modification. The guardsman was experienced and had the laconic northern authority that responded to title not at all and to competence completely. They rode out on a morning that was cold in the final serious way of a winter that knew spring was coming but refused to acknowledge it. The forest north of Winterfell was dense and old in the way that northern forests were old, not picturesque, not the cultivated woodland of southern hunting parks, but genuinely ancient in a way that pressed on human awareness as something prior and indifferent. The trees did not care about the riders moving beneath them. The cold did not care. The gray sky above the canopy did not care. Joffrey rode well, better than he had arrived. The months of work showing in how he sat the horse and managed the terrain. He did not complain about the cold, which Harwin noted in the way that northern men noted things, which was without comment but not without registration. The village was half a day's ride, a cluster of stone buildings and frozen mud that existed in the specific, determined way of northern small folk settlements, not thriving, not comfortable, but enduring, which was its own form of success. The headman was a weathered man of perhaps 50 who looked at the Winterfell guards with relief, and at the boy in the good cloak with careful neutrality. "It's the little boy's sheep, my lord," the headman told Harwin. 3 nights running. No tracks in the snow that make sense. And the little boy himself, he stopped. The little boy himself what? Harwin said. He went looking the 3rd night. Took his dog with him. The headman's voice had gone to the particular flatness of someone managing fear by removing expression from it entirely. The dog came back. He didn't. Joffrey, sitting his horse to Harwin's left, said nothing. His face was doing the thing Ned had identified as genuine attention, not performance of interest, but the real thing, which was quieter and involved listening with more of the body than just the ears. "How old?" Joffrey asked when the headman had finished. The man looked at him, recalibrating. 12, my lord. His name was Edwin. Was, Joffrey said. Not a question. We found him this morning. At the forest edge. The headman's jaw worked. What was left of him? What was left of Edwin Little was not much. And what there was told a story that Harwin read with increasing grimness and that Joffrey observed, with the still, white-faced attention of someone encountering the thing that lies on the other side of the word death. After you've been told it's real. The boy had been 12 years old. He had gone into the woods with his dog, looking for his family's sheep in the specific, unthinking courage of someone who has not yet fully understood that the world can end him. The snow around what remained of him was disturbed in patterns that Harwin could not account for with any explanation that involved ordinary predators. The dog, a large, gray working dog that had come back at dawn and sat by the village gate, making no sound at all, was sitting near the tree line now, equidistant between the forest and the humans, watching with an expression of traumatized incomprehension that animals wore when they had encountered something their instincts had no category for. Wildlings, Joffrey said. Wildlings take livestock when they're starving, Harwin said. They don't leave it scattered. He was looking at the snow patterns. His voice had the flatness of northern men managing something that they were allowing themselves to be frightened by in private. Then what? Harwin looked at him steadily. There are things in the north that the maesters don't have names for, my lord. That's not a comfort. It's just true. They buried what remained of Edwin Little in the village's small yard because the ground was frozen hard enough to make it a serious effort, and the guardsmen did it anyway, taking turns with the pickaxe. Joffrey did not help with the digging. Harwin did not ask him to, and Ned would not have expected him to, but he stood at the grave's edge through the entirety of the burial, in the cold, with his hood back despite the temperature, and he watched the boy go into the ground with the expression of someone committing something to a place in themselves from which it would not easily be retrieved. The headman said what words he knew. The dog sat at the grave's edge and eventually, when the last of the frozen earth was replaced, let out a single sound that was not quite A howl, and not quite a whimper, and not quite anything that had a name, and then went silent. Joffrey rode back to Winterfell through the afternoon's fading light, and said nothing for the first hour. Harwin respected it. The guardsmen respected it. The forest pressed close on both sides, ancient and indifferent, and the cold deepened as the light withdrew. Jon's book, Joffrey said finally, when Winterfell's towers had become visible on the horizon. The long night. It talks about things that come from the cold, things that kill in ways that don't leave tracks. Aye, said Harwin. You believe it. I believe what the evidence in that snow suggested, Harwin said, with the careful precision of a man who had learned to state only what he could defend. I believe that Edwin Little is dead, and that what killed him wasn't an ordinary predator. Beyond that, I make no claims. But you believe it could be what the book describes. Harwin was quiet for a moment, the horse breathing mist in the cold air. I believe that the wall exists for a reason, he said. And I believe that the Night's Watch stands on it for a reason. And I believe that men who've sworn there lives to something as cold and thankless as the Wall's Watch deserve to be taken seriously about what they say. They're watching for. He paused. That's all I'll say on it. Ned heard the account that evening from Harwin, and then separately from Joffrey, who came to the Solar before dinner and told it in full, and in order with a clarity that impressed Ned despite himself, not the breathless drama of a boy recounting adventure, but the methodical accuracy of someone who understood they were reporting something that required accurate transmission. When he'd finished, there was a silence. Edwin Little, Joffrey said. Does his family? Is there someone who provides for them? Now that he's gone. Ned looked at him. He was the eldest son? The headman said so. Then I'll send to the village. Make arrangements. Ned was watching the prince carefully, reading the question for what was underneath it. Why do you ask? Joffrey's jaw worked for a moment. He went looking for the sheep to help his family, he said. He was 12 years old, and he went into the dark too. Help his family, and now he's dead, and they still don't have the sheep. Something moved through the green eyes that was not the sharp, bright anger Ned had learned to watch for, but something duller and heavier. It seems wrong that his family should be worse off for it. It is wrong, Ned said simply. Most things that happen to small folk who do their best and die for it are wrong. The North doesn't fix that wrongness. It just tries not to add to it. Joffrey nodded slowly. I'll send something from my own allowance, he said. For the family. I'm not saying it fixes anything. I know it doesn't fix it, but it seems like something that should be done. Ned regarded his ward for a long moment in the firelight of his solar, and felt something that he had not let himself feel too early for fear of misreading it. Something that was not quite hope and not quite relief, but occupied the territory adjacent to both. The boy in front of him had ridden out that morning capable of abstract acknowledgement that small folk existed and returned capable of understanding, however imperfectly, that their deaths left holes in the world that required response. It was not the transformation of a soul. It was something smaller and more durable, the beginning of a habit of noticing, the beginning of the understanding that the people below a lord's hall were not backdrop, but substance, not furniture, but the reason the furniture existed. I'll match your contribution, Ned said, and we'll send it together under both our names. The surprise on Joffrey's face was genuine and brief, and followed by something that was not quite satisfaction, but was learning the shape of it. He nodded and left for dinner, and Ned sat alone in his solar for a while, watching the fire and thinking about a 12-year-old boy who had gone into the dark for his family's sheep and a prince who had stood at the grave's edge with his hood back in the cold and paid attention to what was in front of him. Outside, the wind came down from the north with news of something vast and patient and cold that had no interest in princes or lessons or the slow, grinding work of trying to make a better man. It came because it came. It always came. But for one evening, in the firelit solar of Winterfell's lord, that could wait. The catastrophe, when it arrived, came in the form Ned Stark had always feared most. Not from the cold, not from the forest, not from anything that announced itself with the honest directness of a physical threat. It came from inside the castle, from the particular human darkness that required warmth and opportunity and a momentary lapse of supervision. And it wore the face of something Ned had believed, with perhaps too much optimism, was retreating. It began with a dog, one of the kitchen hounds, a large, rough-coated animal, of no particular breed that had attached itself to Winterfell's household through the patient strategy of making itself useful, and then indispensable, had been found in the yard, behind the stables with a broken foreleg. The bone had been cleanly snapped, not from a fall or a kick or any of the ordinary accidents that happened to working dogs in a castle's daily life. Lewin's examination was brief and conclusive. The injury was deliberate. The dog had a name. Bran called him Hob, after the castle's cook in the Fond, a logical way that 6-year-olds named things, and Bran was the one who found him, and Bran was the one who came to Ned with the specific kind of distress that children carry when they've encountered a cruelty they don't yet have the architecture to process. Ned asked questions quietly, in the way he asked all serious questions, and the answers came back to him through the architecture of a castle's awareness. Servants who had seen, stable boys who had heard, the particular silence that a household maintained around something it knew but had not been asked directly. Joffrey had been behind the stables, in the hour before dinner, alone, with a short hunting whip from the tack room. Ned sat with this information for a long time before he moved. He sat with it in his solar with the fire burning and the castle going about its evening business around him and the specific, cold weight of something he had been, perhaps, choosing not to see, clearly enough pressing down on him with the patience of a truth that had been waiting for acknowledgement. He thought about the months, the Godswood conversations, the training yard progress, the ranging, and Edwin Little's grave and Joffrey's request to send money to the family. He thought about John's book and the library candle, and the porridge on the first morning and the practice sword in the dark. He assembled the evidence of change carefully, honestly, and he did not dismiss it. It was real. The change was real. He had not imagined it or invented it out of desire. And then he thought about Cersei's letter, and the week that had followed it, and the way the letter had arrived like a hand inserted between two puzzle pieces that had been slowly, imperfectly working their way toward fitting. The boy had been inside something that week. Ned had seen it and told himself it was processing, adjustment, the natural difficulty of a child caught between two gravitational forces. He had given Joffrey privacy, because privacy was part of respect and respect was part of what he was trying to build. He had not looked closely enough at what the privacy was being used for. He found Joffrey in his chambers, reading, or holding a book in the posture of reading, which was different. The prince looked up when Ned entered and registered immediately that this was not an ordinary visit. Something in his expression shifted, braced. Ned closed the door. He did not sit. He stood in the middle of the room and looked at Joffrey with the direct, unperforming regard that he brought to all things that required honesty. And he said, "Tell me about the dog." The green eyes held his for a moment, calculating, not the elaborate calculation of a practiced deceiver, but the simpler, more desperate calculation of someone, deciding whether concealment was still possible. It was not possible, and Joffrey must have seen that in Ned's face, because the calculation resolved itself quickly. "It was running in the yard," Joffrey said, "under the horses. I was worried it would spook them. You broke its leg to stop it spooking the horses." A pause. "I moved it." "Joffrey." Ned's voice was quiet and entirely without heat, which was its most serious register, the one that meant the words inside it had been stripped of everything unnecessary. "I am going to ask you once more, and I want you to understand that the answer I receive will determine something significant about what happens next. Tell me what happened with the dog." The silence in the room had a specific quality, not the working silence of the Godswood or the comfortable silence of the library evenings, but the silence of something cracking under pressure. Joffrey's hands, resting on the closed book in his lap, were very still. "I hit it," he said. His voice was flat, stripped of something. "It wouldn't stop barking. He stopped. I was angry. About something else. It wouldn't stop." "What were you angry about?" The green eyes went to the window. Outside, the early spring sky was the pale, washed gray of a season that hadn't decided yet what it was going to be. "My mother's letter." The second one. Ned knew about the second letter. It had arrived 4 days ago. He had not seen its contents, but he had seen Joffrey in the days that followed. The bracing, the withdrawal, the way the boy had carried himself with the particular tension of someone being pulled in two directions, by forces of equal and significant weight. "You were angry about your mother's letter," Ned said, "and you hurt an animal that could not defend itself, and had done nothing to deserve it." The silence again. Joffrey's jaw was set, but something underneath the set jaw was not defiant. It was something harder to look at, which was the expression of someone who knows they have done wrong, and is still deciding what to do with knowing it. "Yes," the prince said. It was one word. It was not an apology, and it was not an excuse, and it was not the elaborate self-justification that Ned had half expected. It was an admission, clean and unadorned, and Ned gave it the acknowledgement it deserved by receiving it in silence before proceeding. "Stand up," he said. Joffrey stood. "Come with me." Ned took him to the yard where Hob the dog was lying in a bed of straw that Bran had arranged with the meticulous care of a child who could not fix the injury but could make everything around it as comfortable as possible. Bran was not there. Ned had asked Robb to keep him occupied for the evening, because what was about to happen was not for Bran's presence. The dog looked up when they approached. Its foreleg was splinted by Luwin's hand, wrapped in clean linen, and it lay with the patient, confused endurance that animals brought to pain, not dramatizing it, not contextualizing it, simply existing in it. Joffrey looked at the dog for a long moment. "You will take care of this animal," Ned said, "until it heals. You will come to it every morning before training, and every evening before dinner, and you will see to its feed and its water and its comfort. You will do this personally, not through servants. You will sit with it when it is in pain, which it is now, which will be unpleasant for you, because sitting with the consequences of your choices often is." Joffrey's throat moved. "Yes, Lord Stark, that is part of the consequence. The other part is this." Ned turned to face the prince fully, and his voice remained even, remained the same quiet register, because what he was saying did not require volume to land. "I will write to your father. I will tell him what happened. I will tell him the full account, not to destroy you, not to see you punished beyond what is just, but because Robert asked me to make a man of his son, and I cannot do that honestly by concealing what that son has done. Your father deserves to know who he is working with, as will you when you are king." The green eyes came to his face. Something in them was not anger and not calculation, but something rawer. The look of someone who has been told, for perhaps the first time, that the truth about them will be transmitted to someone who matters, and that this is not a threat, but a standard. "He'll be disappointed," Joffrey said. "Yes," Ned agreed. "He will." "He doesn't." Something worked in Joffrey's expression. "He doesn't often pay attention, but when he does and he's disappointed he stopped." Ned waited. "It's the worst thing," Joffrey said. It was very quiet. It was more honest than almost anything the prince had set in the months of Godswood conversations and library evenings, because it was not said to instruct or to demonstrate understanding. It was said because it was simply true, and the boy had said it before he could stop himself. Ned looked at him and felt the complicated thing he often felt in these moments, the convergence of genuine compassion for a child who had been failed by every system that should have protected him, and the absolute refusal to let that compassion become excuse or mitigation. Both were necessary. Only one without the other was useless. "Then you understand why I'm writing to him," Ned said. "Not as punishment, as honesty. Your father will not stop loving you because of this, but he will know, and knowing will be its own weight. And I want you to carry that weight rather than have it hidden from you." Joffrey stood in the yard, beside the injured dog in the early spring, cold and looked like what he was, a boy, 11 years old, made of contradictions that hadn't yet resolved themselves into a person, caught between a mother who loved him into damage and a northern lord who held him to standards she would call cruel, and he was beginning, imperfectly and incompletely, to understand we're not. "I'm sorry," Joffrey said. He was talking to the dog. Ned was not certain the boy knew he was doing it. It came out with the reflexive quality of something said before the mind engaged, the kind of apology that arrived before it was decided upon. The dog's ears moved. It looked up at Joffrey with the uncomplicated, unjudging attention that animals extended to humans, regardless of what those humans had done, which was either nature's most profound mercy or its most complete indifference, and which functioned identically in either case. "Sit with him," Ned said. "I'll send your dinner out." He left the prince there in the straw, in the yard, in the cold spring evening, with the animal he had hurt in the splint. That would take 6 weeks to heal, and the knowledge that Robert would be told, and that the telling was not betrayal, but the opposite of it. The thing that happened when someone took you seriously enough to hold you accountable rather than protect you from the consequence of being yourself. Ned wrote to Robert that night. He wrote it twice. The first version, which was too careful, too diplomatic, too shaped by the awareness of Cersei reading over Robert's shoulder. The second version, which was plain and direct, and said what had happened, and what had been done about it, and what Ned believed it meant. In the larger account of the boy's time in the North, he sent the second version. He sat afterward in his solar and thought about a dog with a broken leg, and a boy sitting in the straw beside it, and the strange, specific mathematics of consequence, how it was almost never sufficient, how it almost never fully repaired what it addressed, and how it was nonetheless the only honest currency the world had for the transaction between action and accountability. Outside, the spring was deciding itself against the winter's last resistance. The ravens went south with their cargo of truth, and Winterfell settled into its evening, and in the yard, a boy sat in the straw until well past dark, and no one came to tell him to come inside. Robert Baratheon arrived in the way that Robert Baratheon arrived everywhere, with noise and horses and the particular disruption of a large man who had never learned to enter a space at less than full force. The outriders came 2 days ahead, and then the column itself. 50 riders and a wheelhouse and the royal banner snapping in the April wind above Winterfell's gate, and the castle received it all with the gray, patient endurance that was its fundamental mode of engagement with everything the world sent northward. Ned stood in the yard to receive his king and his oldest friend, and beside him, at a careful distance that was neither hiding nor presenting itself, stood Joffrey. The prince had asked, the evening before, whether he should be in the yard for the arrival. The asking was itself significant. 6 months ago, the question would not have occurred to him, because 6 months ago, he would have assumed his place in any arrival was at its center. By right and by habit, the asking meant he had developed enough awareness of his own position in this particular drama to understand that it was complicated, that his father was coming north partly because of a letter that contained honest and unflattering things about him, and that the appropriate response to that was neither to hide nor to perform but to be present in a way that acknowledged the complexity. Ned had said yes. Come to the yard. Stand with the household. Let your father see you as you are here, not as you were when you left. Robert came through the gate on a horse that looked slightly too small for him. Robert Baratheon at 35 was still the physical fact of a man who had won a rebellion through the brute credibility of his own body, though the credibility was acquiring the soft amendment of too much wine and too little war. He saw Ned, and his face opened into the grin that had not changed since. They were boys at the Aerys, unguarded, enormous. The grin of a man who had not yet learned to weaponize his own charm because he had never needed to. Ned, he said, and dismounted with the ease of a man still comfortable with horses if not with thrones. And Ned was briefly inside a bear's embrace that smelled of horses and wine and the road's honest sweat. Your Grace, Ned said, which Robert had always hated and Ned had always said anyway, because the form mattered even when the friendship meant it didn't have to. 7 hells, it's cold, Robert announced to the yard at large, which received this assessment with the mild patience of people for whom April was practically warm. His eyes found Joffrey. The king looked at his son across the yard with an expression that was trying to be several things simultaneously: the pride he wanted to perform, the assessment he needed to make, the complicated weight of a father who had sent his child away and was now reading the result. Robert Baratheon was not a subtle man, but he was not a stupid one, and he looked at Joffrey the way he had once looked at battlefields, trying to understand the terrain before committing to a position. Joffrey crossed the yard toward his father with his spine straight and his chin up and his hands at his sides, not running, not performing enthusiasm, just walking toward Robert with the measured deliberateness of someone who had learned that entrances mattered and that the choice of how to cross a space communicated something before a word was said. Father, he said, and stopped at the appropriate distance. and did not throw himself into Robert's arms the way he might have at 8, and did not maintain the formal address of a subject greeting, his king the way Cersei had trained him to do with a specific calculated sweetness. He stood there, in the Stark training yard, in plain wool and good boots, and met his father's eyes. Robert looked at him for a long moment. Something worked. In the king's face, something that started as assessment and arrived somewhere more complicated. "You've grown," Robert said. "A little, your grace." And gotten a scar. Robert's eyes had found the thin line on Joffrey's jaw from a sparring accident 3 weeks ago, where Rob's practice sword had caught him when he'd moved into a strike rather than away from it. Lewin had cleaned and bound it. It was not significant, but it was visible, and Robert was looking at it with an expression Ned couldn't immediately read. "Sparring," Joffrey said. "I moved wrong. Ser Roderick has been working on my defensive footwork since." Robert turned to look at Ser Roderick, who was standing at the yard's edge with the expression of a man who had been teaching for 30 years and had learned to be exactly as present as situations required and no more. The king's expression shifted into something that was not quite a smile, but was its cousin. "Ser Roderick," Robert said. "Does he listen?" "Better than he did," Ser Roderick said, which was not diplomatic and not cruel, and was precisely accurate in the way that northern men calibrated their statements. Robert laughed, a real one, not the performed laughter of the court. It came from somewhere genuine and surprised, and it changed the yard's atmosphere the way laughter sometimes did, releasing something that had been held tense. Even the horses seemed to settle slightly. The first evening was Robert and Ned in the solar, which was how it had always been. Two men who had survived a war and a friendship, across 2 decades of political divergence, sitting in the particular ease of people who had argued about everything and chosen each other anyway. The wine was northern, which Robert assessed with democratic honesty as inferior to Arbor Gold but drinkable. And they talked about the realm's business, with the frank directness that never survived Robert's court but always reconstituted itself in private. "The letter," Robert said, when the first cup was done and the fire had settled. "Tell me what it meant." "It meant what it said," Ned told him. "He hurt a dog in a moment of anger, and I held him accountable and made him sit with the consequence." "And the rest of it? The progress you describe?" "Also what it said." Ned looked at the fire. "He's not transformed, Robert. I want to be clear about that. He's 11 years old, and he still has every instinct Cersei built into him. And they don't disappear, they only get managed. Sometimes redirected. He's developing a habit of noticing people around him as people rather than as furniture. He's learning that competence is its own reward, in a way that approval isn't. He still reaches for cruelty when he's frightened or frustrated. The dog is evidence of that. But he sat with the dog for 3 hours after I left him there, without being told to continue. I had to send someone to bring him in after dark." Robert was quiet for a moment, turning his cup. "Cersei wants him back," he said. "I know. She's been." Robert's jaw set with the particular expression of a man navigating around something he preferred not to examine directly. "She's been making the case that this was a mistake from the beginning, that you've been filling his head with northern separatism, and that the scar on his face is evidence of neglect." "The scar is evidence of sparring," Ned said evenly. "Boys who train properly get scars. It means Ser Roderick is doing his work." "I know that." Robert's voice had an edge that was not directed at Ned. "I know what a sparring scar is, Ned. I have 17 of them." He set down the cup. "She's not entirely wrong, you know. Not about the northern thing. He does seem different, quieter, less." He searched for the word. "Shiny. Is that a problem?" Robert was quiet for a long time. Outside the solar window, Winterfell conducted its nighttime business with the low, purposeful sound of a household that had things to do and did them without ceremony. A dog barked in the distance. Hob, probably, whose leg was healing and who had developed, over the weeks of Joffrey's evening attentions, a specific and apparently genuine attachment to the prince that expressed itself in increasingly dramatic demonstrations of relief when Joffrey appeared. "He called me father," Robert said. "In the yard. Not your grace. Not the way Cersei has him do it in court. That little half-bow and the formal address. He just said father." "Yes," Ned said. "She'll have hated that." Robert said it without satisfaction and without regret, in the tone of a man stating a fact about the weather. She's trained that out of him for years. The informality says it undermines the dignity of the crown. The dignity of the crown will survive being called father by the king's son. Robert almost smiled. Did not, quite. What do you want, Ned? What are you asking for? More time. Another year, Ned said. At minimum. Ideally 2 more. 2 more years. Robert ran a hand over his beard. She'll never agree, Ned said. I know, but you're the king, Robert. You don't require her agreement. The silence between them had the specific weight of a statement that was true and uncomfortable, and both men knew it, and neither was quite willing to push on it because the thing on the other side of it, the reality of Robert's marriage, of Cersei's actual power in his household and his court and his decisions, was a country neither of them had the map for navigating without damage. Let me see him, Robert said. In the morning. Talk to him properly. Not the yard performance. Really talk to him. He picked up his cup again. And in the meantime, tell me about this dog situation. Because I want to understand what you actually did and why. Not Cersei's version of it, which apparently involves you whipping the boy publicly for breaking a household pet. Ned looked at his king with the expression he reserved for the regular discoveries that Cersei Lannister was more inventive than he gave her credit for. Robert and Joffrey walked together along Winterfell's walls the following morning, alone by the king's request, and Ned did not know the content of that conversation and did not ask. What he could observe was the before and after. Robert going up the wall steps with the heavy, slightly reluctant step of a man approaching something he was not certain he was equipped for, and coming back down 40 minutes later with a face that had done something in between. He did not tell Ned what was said. Ned did not ask. What he did say, that afternoon in the solar, while Cersei was engaged in the formal business of inspecting the castle's guest quarters with the expression of someone cataloging deficiencies, was, he told me about the little boy, the ranging. He told me about standing at the grave and what it made him think about. Ned waited. He said. Robert stopped, cleared his throat in the way of men managing something they hadn't prepared to manage. He said he'd been thinking about what it means when the people who work for you die doing something for you, even indirectly, even when it isn't your fault. He said he thought a king should feel that, should feel it every time and not stop feeling it. Robert looked at Ned with something that was complex and genuine, and not often visible on the king's public face. Where did he get that? I'm not certain he got it from anywhere, Ned said carefully. I think he may have arrived at it himself, at the grave. I may have provided some of the language for it later. But the impulse, I think that was his. Robert nodded, said nothing for a moment. Then, 2 more years, he said. I'll manage Cersei. Ned had lived long enough and known Robert long enough to understand that I'll manage Cersei was a statement of intention that did not necessarily correspond to outcomes, and that managing Cersei Lannister was an endeavor that had defeated better prepared men than Robert on a consistent basis. But it was what Robert had to offer, and Ned accepted it because the alternative was accepting less. Cersei found him that evening, sought him out in the corridor, outside the great hall with the deliberateness of a woman who had chosen her moment and her ground. She was magnificent in the way she was always magnificent, controlled and golden and wearing her beauty as body armor, the warmth in her smile precisely calibrated, the green eyes reading him with intelligence he would have admired in another context. Lord Stark, she said. A word. The word was 15 minutes and covered in the elegant, circling language of a woman who never said a threatening thing directly. The following. She was grateful for his hospitality and his care. She recognized his intentions were good. She believed the North had given her son certain qualities she could acknowledge were useful, and she wanted him to understand, clearly and without ambiguity, that Joffrey was a Lannister and a Baratheon and would be king, and that whatever Ned Stark was building in this cold gray castle, it would come south with her son and meet the reality of what power actually required in King's Landing, and that she, Cersei, would be there to help her son navigate that reality in ways that a northern lord, however honorable, was not equipped to do. It was beautifully done, not a single threat, not a single statement that could be quoted as hostile, just the architecture of a warning, built from courtesies and compliments, and the carefully placed negative space of everything. She was not saying. Ned listened to all of it, and when she had finished, he said, "I appreciate your confidence in my intentions. Your Grace, Joffrey is a credit to both his parents in different ways. I hope what he learns here serves him well." Cersei smiled at him, and the smile was a door closing. She left him in the corridor, and Ned stood for a moment in the torchlight listening to the castle around him, the fire in the great hall, the distant bark of a healing dog, the cold pressing at the outer walls with the patient certainty of something that had been doing this longer than the castle had been standing. 2 more years. Robert had said it. Whether Robert could hold to it against the pressure that would begin the moment the column rode south was a question Ned could not answer. He went to find his wife, because some questions needed to be shared before they could be properly weighed, and because Catelyn had been watching Cersei with the specific attention of a woman reading another woman's strategy, and her assessment would be more accurate than his. Outside, the spring evening was cold and honest, which were the North's 2 most reliable qualities and the ones Ned had staked everything on in the end. Jon Arryn died on a Thursday. The Raven came from King's Landing in the gray hour before dawn, when Winterfell was in the particular quiet of a castle between its nighttime and its morning. The fires banked low and the servants, not yet moving in the world, outside the walls holding its breath in the way of late spring nights that had not quite committed to warmth. Maester Luwin brought the message to Ned's chambers himself, which was how Ned knew before he broke the seal that it was something that would not wait for a reasonable hour. He read it twice, then sat at the edge of his bed in the dark for a long time, feeling the weight of it settle over him the way the North's cold settled, gradually, completely, without mercy and without apology. Jon Arryn was dead. The hand of the king was dead, and beneath the formal language of the Raven's message, in the space between what was written and what was meant, Ned could read the outline of something he had been afraid of for a long time without letting himself examine it directly. Since that King's Landing was a machine that consumed good men, and that the machine's appetite was not sated, and that it was now turning its attention northward. He did not tell Joffrey that morning. He told Catelyn in the privacy of their chambers, and he told her all of it, not just Jon Arryn's death, but what he suspected beneath it, the questions the timing raised, the implications for the realm and for the position he now feared Robert would ask him to fill. Catelyn received it in the way she received difficult news, which was to become very still and very clear. Her assessment was immediate and accurate and not what Ned wanted to hear, which was also how her assessments tended to work. "He'll ask you to be hand," she said. "Yes. And if you refuse?" Ned looked at the window. Outside, Winterfell's morning was beginning. The sounds of the stable, the kitchen fires being built back up, the particular creak of the gate being opened for the day's first business. "I don't think I can refuse. Not if he asks it the right way." He paused. "Not if the realm needs it." "The realm always needs it," Catelyn said, with the quiet bitterness of a woman who had spent her marriage, understanding that Ned Stark's sense of duty was not a quality that could be rationed or redirected. "The realm needed it when Robert asked you to ride to war at 17. The realm needed it when he asked you to go south and bring Lyanna home. The realm." "Cat." She stopped. Her hands in her lap were still. "What happens to the boy if you go south?" It was the question Ned had been circling since he broke the seal. Joffrey had been in Winterfell for 8 months. He had changed in ways that were real and in ways that were fragile, and the fragility was the point. The change was new enough that it had not yet fully integrated into who the boy was. It was a surface that had been laid over a foundation that still had fissures, and what it needed was time and continued pressure and the continued presence of someone who held it to account. If Ned went south, the person doing the holding would change. The standard would change. The environment would change. And Cersei, who had been managing the situation from distance with considerable effectiveness, would be in the same city as her son, with all the proximity that implied. "I don't know," Ned said, which was honest and therefore, in the circumstances, deeply inadequate. He told Joffrey 2 days before Robert arrived to ask, because he owed the boy the information before it became public and because he wanted to observe how Joffrey received it without the additional variable of the king's presence in the castle. They were in the training yard. The morning session just finished, Ser Roderick having dismissed the others. The yard emptying with the purposeful flow of people with the next task already in mind. Joffrey was wiping down his practice sword with the habitual care that Ser Roderick had drilled into all of them. The small maintenance rituals that were themselves a form of discipline. Jon Arryn is dead, Ned said, without preamble, because Joffrey had learned to read careful approaches as the prelude to significant information in the reading itself created anxiety. That was not useful. The practice sword went still in Joffrey's hands. The green eyes came up. He was my father's hand, the prince said. For 17 years. He was a good man. He served the realm honestly and well for a long time. Ned paused. Your father will need to name a replacement. Something moved through Joffrey's expression, the rapid, visible calculation of someone assembling implications from components. The boy had become considerably more capable of this over the months. Maester Luwin had noted it in his quiet way. The development of something that might eventually be genuine political intelligence, not the borrowed cunning of Cersei's instruction, but the original kind, built from actual engagement with how things worked and what they meant. He'll ask you, Joffrey said. Not a question. I believe so. And you'll go. Ned looked at him. I don't know yet. The green eyes were steady on his. You'll go, Joffrey said again. Not accusatory, just certain, in the way that people who had spent time watching. Ned Stark understood that his sense of obligation was not a lever to be pulled but a fixed point, around which everything else arranged itself. You won't be able to say no if the realm needs it. You've told me as much, even if you haven't said it in those words. When did I say that? You said a man who passes the sentence should swing the sword. Joffrey set down the practice sword, leaning it carefully against the fence, the care itself something learned rather than natural. You said a lord owes his people his actual presence in the hard decisions, not just his approval from a distance. If the realm needs a hand, and you're the man best placed to do it, then going is the same as swinging the sword yourself. Not going is sending someone else, which you said was wrong. Ned was quiet for a moment. It was not a comfortable moment. You've been paying attention, he said. You told me to. A pause. What happens to me if you go south? The question was direct and unguarded in a way that Joffrey's questions had not always been, not shaped for effect, not positioned, just asked. What happens to me? The particular honesty of someone who has stopped performing their concerns and started simply having them. That depends on several things, Ned said. On your father's plans. On what arrangement can be made. He looked at the boy steadily. What do you want to happen? The silence that followed had a specific texture, the texture of someone confronting a question they had not expected to be asked and discovering that they had an answer they hadn't prepared. Joffrey's gaze went to the training yard, the fence, the walls of Winterfell rising gray and patient around them, and his expression moved through something complicated before settling. I want to stay, he said. I know that's not. I know it probably isn't possible. I know my mother will. He stopped. Started differently. There are things here I haven't finished. What things? Robb still beats me 4 out of 5. The jaw set. But it was the good set, the one pointed at something rather than against it. I said I wanted it to be 3 before I left. It's not 3 yet. A pause. And I haven't. There's a boy in the village past the Wolf's Wood. His father is a tanner. He came to the gate last month to ask about apprenticeship in the castle. He was... Joffrey stopped, seeming to hear himself. Ned waited. He reminded me of Edwin Little, the prince said. I told Luwin to look into the apprenticeship. I want to know what happens with it before I leave. It was such a small thing. It was such a profoundly significant small thing. A prince of the realm remembering a dead village. Boy and connecting that memory to a living one and acting on the connection, not grandly, not publicly, not in any way that would serve a reputation or generate approval, but quietly and specifically, and because it had occurred to him that it should be done. Ned looked at Joffrey Baratheon in the spring training yard of Winterfell and felt, alongside everything else, the particular grief of a man who has invested in something and is watching the investment begin to bear fruit at the precise moment the conditions for its growth are about to change. I'll do what I can, he said. For the time, Robert arrived with all his noise and his horses and his retinue. And this time Cersei was not with him. She had remained in King's Landing, which told Ned something about how confident she was in the outcome of this visit, that she had not felt the need to manage it personally. The conversation happened the way Ned had known it would happen, which was to say inevitably, in the Godswood, which was where Robert always went when he wanted to speak, plainly, and which Ned had always found both convenient and slightly ironic given that Robert had no particular feeling for the old gods. I need you south, Ned. I know. The realm is in a state. Robert's voice had the weight of something he'd been carrying and was finally setting down, with the particular relief and weariness of that gesture. There are things happening in King's Landing that John was looking into things before he died. Things I need a man I trust to continue looking into. Things that if they're true, he stopped. I need you, Ned. There's no one else. Ned looked at the heart tree. The carved face looked back with its patient, ancient indifference. He thought about Caitlyn's still hands in the firelight. He thought about a practice sword leaned carefully against a fence. He thought about a boy, asking about a tanner's son from a village past the Wolfswood. I'll come south, he said. On conditions. Robert looked at him with surprise. Not that Ned would have conditions, but that Ned would name them, which was less characteristic. Joffrey stays north, Ned said. Through the summer, at minimum. He's not finished here. Robert was quiet for a moment. Cersei will. I know what Cersei will do. I'm asking what you will do. Ned met his king's eyes directly, with the steady, unapologetic regard that was Ned Stark's particular form of courage, not the dramatic courage of battlefields, but the harder, quieter courage of maintaining a position against pressure from someone you loved and feared disappointing. Robert, your son is becoming something he couldn't have become in King's Landing. Something you wrote to me about wanting. I am asking you to protect that becoming, at political cost to yourself, because it is more important than Cersei's feelings about it and more important than the court's expectations, and more important than, he paused, feeling for the end of it. It is more important than almost anything else I can think of, because who he becomes is what the realm gets for the rest of everyone's lives. Robert looked at the heart tree for a long time. The red leaves moved in the late spring wind. Somewhere on the other side of the Godswood wall, the castle's mourning continued with its ordinary business, indifferent to the weight of what was being decided in here. Through the summer, Robert said. I'll hold her off through the summer. Thank you. Don't thank me. Manage her correspondence when it arrives. I can feel it coming from here. He looked at Ned with an expression that had, underneath everything, the remnant of the grin from the day before, the unguarded one, the one from before the throne. You know you're going to hate King's Landing. Yes, Ned said. I know. And you're coming anyway. And I'm coming anyway. Robert nodded. They sat in the Godswood for a while longer. Two men who had chosen each other across all the reasons not to, while the heart tree kept its counsel and the spring light moved slowly through the red leaves overhead. Ned told Joffrey that evening. The prince received it in the library, which was where he spent his evenings more often than not now. Frequently with John, occasionally alone. He listened to the full account, that Ned was going south, that the arrangement for his remaining was secured through the summer, that Caitlyn and Robb and the household would continue in Winterfell, that Ser Roderick had been spoken to and would continue the training, that Maester Luwin had been asked to continue the afternoon lessons with particular attention to governance and the histories of ruling families. Joffrey listened to all of it without interrupting, which had itself become one of the year's more significant developments. When Ned finished, the prince was quiet for a moment. The tanner's boy, he said. The apprenticeship. Luwin has approved it. He starts with the castle carpenter next month. Something in Joffrey's expression settled, the specific settling of someone who has been waiting for a small, specific thing and found it resolved. He nodded. Will you write? He asked. And then, immediately, with the reflexive bracing of someone who has learned not to need. You don't have to. I know you'll be busy. I know King's Landing is. All right, Ned said. The green eyes held his for a moment, and in them was the thing that had been building all year in the layered, imperfect, frequently interrupted way that things built in real children in real circumstances. Not transformation, not the clean narrative of a soul redeemed, but something smaller and more durable. The beginning of a person who understood that the world owed him nothing, and that this was not a tragedy but a starting point. The beginning of a king who might, under the right conditions and with enough continued pressure and enough honest accounting, become something the Iron Throne had not had in a very long time. Whether King's Landing would allow those conditions to continue was a question. Ned was heading south to find out, at significant personal cost, because the man who passes the sentence should swing the sword, and because the boy in the library chair with the healing scar on his jaw and the borrowed book on the long night open in his lap was worth whatever the cost turned out to be. "Good night, my lord," Joffrey said. "Good night," Ned said, and left the boy to his reading. In the firelit library, in the Greystone Castle, at the edge of the world's cold, honest north, King's Landing consumed Ned Stark, the way it consumed everything that came to it from the north, gradually, then completely, with the patient, systemic efficiency of a city that had been processing honorable men into cautionary tales for 3 centuries and had refined the mechanism to something close to art. He had been gone for months when the first of the letters came back to Winterfell changed, not in content. Ned's letters to Joffrey were what they had always been, direct and honest and spare in the way of a man who wrote what he meant and nothing additional. But something in the spaces between the sentences had altered, a new economy of expression that Joffrey, who had spent a year learning to read Ned Stark's silences, understood was not efficiency but compression, the compression of a man managing more than he could say in a letter that might be read by eyes other than the intended ones. "The city is as I remembered it," Ned wrote, "loud and warm and full of people who know things they won't say directly. Your father is well. The small council meets regularly. I am learning the rhythms of it." What this communicated to Joffrey, who read it twice in the library and then once more slowly, that Ned found King's Landing exhausting, that Robert was not entirely well, that the small council contained people Ned did not trust, and that he was navigating something considerably more complex and dangerous than he was prepared to describe in a Raven's message. Joffrey wrote back. His letters had become, over the months and then the summer, something he took seriously, in the way he had come to take the things that mattered seriously, with deliberate attention and the willingness to draft and revise, which Maester Luwin had observed, with the quiet satisfaction of a teacher watching a student discover that effort produced better results than facility. He told Ned about the training. Robb had beaten him 3 out of 5 for the first time in July, and then 3 out of 5 again in August, and the third session had been 2 out of 5, which Ser Roderick had acknowledged with the economy of a man for whom extraordinary things required ordinary language. He told Ned about the carpenter's apprentice, the tanner's boy, whose name was Willem, who had turned out to have a genuine aptitude for joinery and who Bran had adopted as a friend with the indiscriminate warmth that Bran applied to most things. He told Ned about Jon's latest letter from Castle Black, where Jon had gone to take the Black in the summer, a decision that had surprised the household, and not surprised Ned, who had written to Joffrey about it with a brief, honest grief that Joffrey had recognized as the specific sorrow of someone watching someone they loved do the right thing at great cost. He did not write about Cersei's letters. They came every week now, regular as tides, and they had shifted in tone from the honeyed pull of the earlier correspondence to something more urgent and less patient. His mother wanted him home. His mother had moved past wanting into a register that Joffrey was beginning to understand. Was not love failing but love, revealing itself, the quality that had always been underneath it, the possession, the inability to distinguish between his well-being and her control of it. He read the letters and thought about what Ned had said about armor, and about Cersei building hers to survive a world that punished softness, and about how armor built for one world could be the wrong protection in another. He thought about this carefully, and without the reflexive defensiveness that the thinking would have produced a year ago, and what he arrived at, slowly and imperfectly, was something he didn't have quite the right words for yet. The understanding that his mother's love was real and that its realness did not make it right, that these two things could be simultaneously true, and that recognizing both without collapsing into either was one of the hardest things a person could be asked to do. He was 12 years old and arriving at this understanding in the library of a northern castle in the autumn dark, and it was not clean and it was not complete, and it would require the work of years to properly integrate into a way of moving through the world. But it was there, the shape of it, which was more than it had been. The news of Jon Arryn's true cause of death reached Winterfell not through official channels, but through Jon's letter from Castle Black, which arrived in late October carrying secondhand information that Jon had received from a Night's Watch brother who had been in King's Landing, fragmented, uncertain, and deeply alarming in the way that fragmented, uncertain things were when the fragments fit a shape you had been hoping wouldn't resolve into anything coherent. Jon Arryn had been asking questions before he died, questions about the king's children, questions about bloodlines and inheritance and the color of eyes across generations of Baratheon ancestry, and the questions had stopped when he died, which was its own kind of answer, about whether he had been allowed to finish asking them. Joffrey read Jon's letter in his chambers alone and sat with it for a long time. He was not stupid. He had never been stupid. Stupidity had never been his failing, which was part of what had made his early cruelty so deliberate and therefore so inexcusable. And he had spent a year being educated by Maester Luwin in the actual histories of the great houses and their bloodlines. And he had spent considerable time in the library reading Jon's books and other books, and he had the specific Lannister-inherited quality of pattern recognition that was one of Cersei's genuine gifts to him regardless of everything else. He knew what green eyes meant in the historical record of Baratheon inheritance. He had known it in the unexamined way of someone who has the information but has not yet assembled it into a conclusion. For several months, Jon Arryn's questions pulled the pieces into arrangement with the force of an inevitability that had always been there waiting. He sat with the conclusion for 3 days before he told anyone, not because he was deciding whether to tell. He was always going to tell. The year in Winterfell had built many things in him, and one of them, perhaps the most durable, because it had been built not through instruction but through watching Ned Stark actually live it, was the understanding that the man who passes the sentence should swing the sword, and that the equivalent of swinging the sword in this particular situation was saying the thing directly to the person who needed to hear it rather than managing it, burying it, or leveraging it. He told Robb, not because Robb was the obvious choice, but because Robb was there, and was steady, and was the person in the castle who would receive this information in the most useful way, not with drama, not with political calculation, but with the northern directness that assessed what was in front of it and then decided what to do. They were in the training yard. The session just finished. The October cold pressing in from the north with the serious quality of a season fully committed to itself. Joffrey told Robb what he had worked out, methodically, in order, with the evidence assembled carefully, the way Maester Luwin had taught him to assemble an argument, not stating the conclusion first but building to it, laying the stones in sequence, letting the structure speak. Robb listened without interrupting. His face did the thing it did when he was processing something significant, a stillness that was not blankness but concentration, the internal work of a man who took things seriously, made visible in the temporary suspension of everything else. When Joffrey finished, Robb was quiet for a long moment. "You're certain," Robb said, "as certain as I can be without confirmation that I can't get." Joffrey looked at him steadily. Jon Arryn was killed for asking these questions. "My mother," he stopped. "I believe my mother knows I'm working this out. I think the urgency in her recent letters is not only about wanting me home. I think it's about wanting me home before I have conversations like this one." Robb looked at the training yard walls, the gray stone, the October sky above them. "Father needs to know," he said. "Yes. He's in King's Landing." "Yes." Joffrey paused. "With my mother, and Varys, and Littlefinger, and everyone else who already knows or suspects and is already deciding what to do with knowing." The weight of this settled between them in the cold air. It was, Joffrey understood, one of those moments that would be divided by itself, before and after, the before being a life in which certain things were possibilities, and the after being a life in which they were facts. He had been in several such moments in the past year. The dog in the straw, Edwin Little's grave, Jon's candle in the library. Each one had cost him something and given him something, and the exchange had not always felt fair in the moment, but had generally revealed itself as necessary in retrospect. "Write to Father tonight," Robb said. "I'll write too. Between us we can." He stopped, recalculating. "We can't say it directly in a letter. If it's intercepted, I know. Joffrey had thought about this. I know how to say it so he understands without anyone else understanding. He'll know what I mean. A pause. I've been paying attention to how he writes to me when he can't say things directly. I can do it the same way. Robb looked at him with an expression that was not quite surprise, but was its adjacent territory, the look of someone seeing something they had been observing develop arrive at a new stage of completion. All right, Robb said. They wrote that evening, separately and then together, comparing drafts, in the library by candlelight, in the way they had never quite done before. The Lord's heir and the prince, in the firelight, working on something that mattered with the shared, focused attention of two people who had arrived, through a year of friction and proximity, and the slow erosion of their mutual wariness, at something that was not friendship, exactly, but occupied the territory, adjacent to it, and had some of its properties. The letters went south with the Dawn Courier. Whether they would arrive in time, whether Ned would read them before something else happened, whether King's Landing would allow the information to reach the person it needed to reach, without being intercepted or redirected by the considerable intelligence already operating in that city. These were questions that the morning courier's departure could not answer, and that Winterfell's gray walls could not resolve. What Winterfell could do, and did, was continue. The training went on. Joffrey and Robb sparred in the November cold with the particular intensity of two people who had something else on their minds and were using the physical work to manage it. Ser Roderick watched from the fence with his customary economy of expression and said nothing about what he observed, which was that the prince's footwork had quietly, over the autumn, become genuinely good. Not good for a prince. Not good considering his starting point, but good in the absolute sense. The sense that would matter in a real fight rather than a demonstration. Maester Luwin continued the afternoon lessons. He had shifted the curriculum over the summer, at Ned's written instruction, toward the practical governance of kingdoms, the management of competing lords, the economics of feeding armies, the political mathematics of alliance and enmity, the history of what happened to kings who mistook cruelty for strength and what happened to kings who mistook gentleness for wisdom. Joffrey engaged with this material with an appetite that was new and genuine, and that Luwin recorded in his careful notes, with the measured satisfaction of a man who had been doing this long enough to recognize genuine intellectual curiosity when it appeared. Bran had adopted Joffrey in the way that Bran adopted things, fully and without reservation, and with the particular tenacity of a child who had decided that something was his and was not interested in arguments to the contrary. He appeared regularly in doorways when Joffrey was studying or training or sitting with Hob the dog, whose leg had healed completely, and who now followed the prince through the castle with the devoted, slightly anxious attention of an animal that had decided this was its person and was not willing to revisit the decision. Arya continued to be Arya, which meant that she said true things at inconvenient moments and was generally the least impressed person in any room, regardless of who was in it. She had decided, over the summer, that Joffrey was acceptable, in the specific way that Arya declared things acceptable, not with praise, but with the cessation of active hostility, which in her register functioned as considerable warmth. She told him once, in passing, in the yard, on a morning when neither of them was doing anything important, "You're less terrible than you were." It was the finest compliment she had in her vocabulary for people who were not her family, and Joffrey received it with the solemnity it deserved. "Thank you," he said. "Don't make it weird," she said, and walked away. The letter that came in December was not from Ned. It was from Varys, which was itself a communication of some significance. The spider did not write letters to 12-year-old princes fostered in the north without specific and deliberate reason. The letter was brief and circumspect in the way of a man who knew that everything he wrote might be read by someone other than the recipient, and who had spent decades crafting language that meant different things to different readers. What it meant to Joffrey, who had spent several months studying the history of Varys and his methods, and who had spent a year learning to read the spaces between words. "Your father has received your letter. He understands. He is moving carefully. King's Landing is moving faster than careful. Be ready." Be ready for what? The letter did not say. Be ready in what way? The letter did not say. Varys's letters never said the thing directly because Varys understood, better than anyone in the Seven Kingdoms, that the thing said directly was the thing most easily used against you. Joffrey sat with the letter for an afternoon, and then burned it in the library hearth and told Robb its contents from memory, which Robb received with the same stillness he brought to all significant things. "We wait," Robb said. "We wait," Joffrey agreed. Outside, the first serious snow of winter came down on Winterfell in the thick, indiscriminate sheets of a season that had fully arrived and was not planning to leave. It covered the training yard and the godswood and the stables and the gate and the road south with the same patient white, and the castle settled into its winter rhythms with the ease of a place that had been doing this for 8,000 years and had, in all that time, developed complete competence at endurance. Joffrey stood at the window of his chambers and watched the snow and thought about King's Landing, which he had not seen in 14 months and which existed in his imagination as a place that was warm and loud and full of people who wanted things from each other and from him and from every interaction they entered. A place that was the opposite of this window and this snow and this gray, honest castle that had asked nothing from him except that he be better than he had been. He was better than he had been. Not enough. Not finished. Not safe from the person he had been before the wheelhouse and the cold and the training yard and the godswood and the man who had looked at him without wanting anything from the looking, but better in the genuine sense, the durable sense, the sense that lived in the body rather than in the performance of the self, in the elbow that stayed in automatically now, in the hand that did not reach for the whip when something went wrong, in the eyes that saw held of the serving woman when she set down the porridge and the tanner's boy when he walked through the castle yard and the grave of a 12-year-old who had gone into the dark for his family's sheep. He did not know what was coming from King's Landing. He did not know what Ned had found or what Robert had decided or what Cersei was building in the warm, complicated south. He did not know what Varys's letter meant by ready or whether being ready was something he was capable of. He knew that spring would come eventually. He knew that Robb would beat him 4 times out of 5 tomorrow, and he would work until the ratio changed. He knew that Hobb would be at his door in the morning, anxious and devoted, and that Willem the tanner's boy would be in the carpenter's workshop making something with his hands, and that Bran would appear in some doorway before noon with a question about something entirely unrelated to anything that mattered, and entirely necessary, in the way that Bran's questions always turned out to be. He knew that Ned Stark was in King's Landing doing the thing that Ned Stark did, which was standing in the place where something needed to be stood and bearing the weight of it without complaint and without apology, and with the plain, enduring, deeply unfashionable integrity that King's Landing would try to destroy and that might or might not survive the trying. He knew that the snow was falling on Winterfell and that the cold was honest and that the North had given him something he did not have words for yet, and that the words would come eventually if he kept paying attention. The candle in his window cast its small light against the dark outside, visible from the training yard below where the snow was accumulating on the fence posts and the practice swords racked against the wall, and from the godswood where the heart tree's carved face looked out at the white world with its ancient expression that was not approval and not condemnation, but something older than both. A different king was coming to the Iron Throne. Not a good king, not yet, perhaps not ever, in the clean way that songs required, but a king who had stood at a dead boy's grave with his hood down in the cold. A king who had sat in straw beside an animal he had hurt until the dark came down. A king who had learned, imperfectly and at real cost and with frequent failure, that the people below the hall were not backdrop, but substance. Whether it would be enough, whether the North's lessons would survive King's Landing's instruction, whether what had been built in the gray castle at the world's cold edge would hold against everything the warm, complicated South was about to do to it, was a question the snow did not answer and the heart tree did not answer and the candle in the window could not resolve. Westeros would find out in time. It always did. What the North built in Joffrey Baratheon was not a good man. It was something more complicated and arguably more useful, a person capable of recognizing the difference between good and its absence, which was not the same. Thing is always choosing it, but was the necessary precondition of the choice being real. He left Winterfell in the spring of his 13th year, thinner than he'd arrived and harder in the places where hardness was honest and softer, in the places where softness was earned. He carried with him a scar on his jaw, a dog that refused to stay behind, a habit of noticing small folk that he could not entirely suppress, even in rooms where it was inconvenient, and the memory of a man who had looked at him without wanting anything from the looking. King's Landing received him with its noise and its warmth and its beautiful, comprehensive machinery of corruption, and Cersei received him with her arms and her relief and the love that was real and ruinous simultaneously, and the court received him with the deference he had once required, and now found faintly obscene. What he did with all of it, with the North's lessons and the South's pressure and the secret that was already moving through King's Landing like wildfire through a hidden passage, would take years to fully reveal. Ned Stark had done what he could. He had swung the sword himself, and the cut he had made was real. Winter still came for everyone, but something in it had changed.